Good morning, everyone, or good morning, at least for me. I'm in the East and it's 10:30 a.m. on Friday. Thank you so much for coming. I know that we're coming from all over, which is wonderful. I see a lot of familiar names and faces from the UVM course and elsewhere. It's always wonderful to gather together. We have an exciting hour for you planned, and we also will welcome you to be a part of it and your wisdom and thoughts and questions. So to start out, I'm going to give you a brief overview of our agenda. So we're going to meet the panel. We have a panel of 3. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Map of Memory Lane, my new picture book, which I hope will be a useful tool in all of your death care provider bags. And then I'm going to lead a bit of a Q&A with our 2 panelists, and then I'll open it up for everyone to be able to ask questions, and it'll be a little more interactive. Depending on our timing, we might even have a chance to do some story sharing from our own lives and work. So that's what we're in for today. All right, so I'm going to pop over so I can read the bios. All right, so we have Jess Boyea, and Jess is a registered nurse and the state coordinator for Vermont's Pediatric Palliative Care Program. For the first 10 years of her nursing career, Jess was a labor and delivery nurse and also worked as a maternal child clinical instructor for the nursing program at the University of Vermont. After her time on labor and delivery, Jess transitioned to working as a maternal and child home health nurse. While working at home health, Jess served first-time medical-eligible moms as a nurse family practitioner home visitor, provided lactation support to new families as an international board-certified lactation consultant, and provided medical support to children in their homes as a medical nurse. She also served children diagnosed with life-limiting illness and their families as the Pediatric Palliative Care Program coordinator, and worked as the clinical nurse manager for maternal child health. Jess is a graduate of the first cohort of the UVM End-of-Life Doula program. In her current role, Jess provides oversight and management to the Pediatric Palliative Care Program in the state of Vermont and supports, educates, and collaborates with multidisciplinary teams to provide compassionate care and to improve quality of life for seriously ill children and their families. When not working, Jess loves to spend time with her family, run in the forest, and listen to live music. Then we have Allie Waltine. Allie is a rostered psychotherapist in private practice in South Burlington, Vermont. Allie started her career as a certified child life specialist for 12 years at UVM Children's Hospital, first working with children facing their own medical interventions, and then designing and implementing a program focused on supporting children of adult patients. As a child life specialist, I'm letting people in too. Allie supported families impacted by significant medical stressors. Hold on, sorry, I'm trying to bounce back and forth.
Yeah, it doesn't look like I can let people in anymore, so I can't help you.
That's okay. As a child life specialist, Allie supported families impacted by significant medical stressors, worked with families to find developmentally appropriate and gentle ways to speak with children about serious illness, and helped families navigate the complexities of end of life. Allie co-facilitated a family grief support group for 11 years and has volunteered time throughout the past decade with Camp Knock Knock, a family bereavement camp run by UVM Home Health and Hospice. As a private practice clinician, Allie continues to work with children and families impacted by serious illness, grief, and loss, and aims to bring creativity and compassion into all of her interactions. When not working, Allie lives in Ferrisburg with her family and enjoys gardening and being outside. So thank you both for being a part of this. And briefly about me, I think many of you probably know me and we've already connected, so I'll just keep it really quick. I am the course developer for the UVM End-of-Life Doula training programs. So that includes our 8-week online program, which provides the foundational skills for practicing as a private practice doula or for incorporating end-of-life doula approaches and skills into your own practice, whatever hat you wear. And then our other training program, which is focused on pet loss and grief as well. I am a researcher with Vermont Conversation Lab, and currently we're working on our story listening project. So we have a number of graduates from the UVM doula program who are now specially trained as story listening doulas. And we are actively recruiting people who have experienced a loss during the pandemic to share their story with a story listening doula. So you can find out about that and help spread the word about that intervention at the Vermont Conversation Lab website, which is really easy to find. I also wrote Cultivating the Doula Heart, Essentials of Compassionate Care, which is a guidebook for doulas, and most recently, Map of Memory Lane, which I'll be talking about a little bit today. So that's us, and we're also happy to have you and your doula hearts and brains and your expertise joining us as well. I wanted to give us a little bit of framework for our talk and just let everyone know that our intention is to create a space that feels safe and welcoming for everyone who's here and for everyone who will be watching the recording later on in the future. And so by that, we'll set the intention that everything that we share with sensitivity, knowing that some people will be triggered by potentially the more graphic details of trauma or end-of-life experiences. So if we can kind of keep that in mind so that we can practice as trauma-sensitive people here, and that you are welcome to share your own stories from your life and work as well at the end. But we will be talking about a difficult subject. It's about children who are experiencing impending loss and then children who are deep in grief. So it's not without its complications and potential heaviness here. Okay, so my aim with writing Map of Memory Lane was to provide a gentle initial invitation to young people into this topic of loss, because for a number of reasons. Personal reasons, I was inspired by a conversation I had with my own grandmother long ago. And I had asked her if she would die. I just randomly out of the blue blurted it out. Graham, are you going to die? And I think she was maybe 55 at the time. She was very young considering, and she handled it well. She said that she would at some point, but that she wasn't scared and that she had lived a good life. And so she was able to very quickly calm my nerves, comfort me, but not overwhelm me with information, which is not what I needed at that moment, because that was really my initial conversation about this. And so that has stuck with me. And that was the inspiration between the conversation of Lee and Lee's Nana. And Lee has a little more tact and asks, Nana, will you live forever? So in this book, with intention, I didn't even mention the word death or dying, because I really want it to be this very comforting, comfortable, safe place for children and their adults to explore this topic. And not everybody's ready to kind of jump in, as a lot of us are in the field. We can readily talk about this topic and say the accurate terms in our way of increasing our cultural ability to turn toward these realities. So that's the intention with the book. And then I have the companion activity book as well, which is readily available. If you haven't gotten yours through either my email list or through the Kickstarter campaign, then you can sign up for my emails on francescalynnarnoldy.com, or you can just email me directly and I'm happy to give you copies of that. So that is an interactive, customizable, personalizable. It's just it's my hope that people will take this file and create their own map of memory lane and their own keepsake with someone. So it could either be in honor of someone or a pet potentially that has already died. And it could be a number of reflections and a process of capturing those memories, either in writing and or drawings and or mementos. It can be a combination of things. So like a photo book, scrapbook sort of idea. And it can be as simple or as complex depending on the developmental stage of the child and the needs of the family and whatever supplies people might have accessible or not. It can be done with a pencil and that's it, or it could be done with collaging from a magazine. It's really kind of up to the people that are finishing it. So it also has an opener that includes tips for supporting children through difficult conversations and the inevitability of loss. So some quick tips that are included there are follow their lead, use clear language, don't feel pressured to know everything, and welcome it all. Later on in our hour, I will be giving away a couple of copies, and I have some seconds that came in with slight imperfections that I'm not going to sell. Probably to the normal eye, you won't even notice some of these things. It could be just a poor cutting job at the bottom of a page or something. But of course, to my eyes, because I've been looking at this book for so long and know every single detail of it, I can spot some of this. So I'm going to send along a couple of those copies with some really cute postcards that go with the book. And I'm hopeful that people will use these postcards to send to someone. It has a little prompt, a trip down memory lane, and that you might send it out with a special memory of someone. All right, so I'm very excited to now ask some questions to our panelists because I am curious and because I always enjoy learning more, and especially from people who work in different capacities than I do, for my own awareness about what is available. Lucky for me, this is local to me, but also, elsewhere, what might be out there for families and children who are facing loss and grief. So my first question, I'm going to send it to Allie. So from your experience in life and or work, could you describe a tenet of care that you've discovered for supporting youth through impending loss and bereavement?
Sure. I think authenticity, if that could be considered a tenet. I think that we all show up to this work as our own unique selves and getting ready to support people in their own unique journeys. So I think that authenticity is so, so important because I think that this is such a heavy topic. And when we bring in the idea of incorporating children into it, it feels heavier, right? It feels like it kind of goes against our adult instincts to want to welcome children into these tough conversations, even though we all know logically that it's so important. So I think that we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to say like exactly the right thing at exactly the right time and in exactly the right way, which in reality doesn't exist. So if we can get comfortable with showing up with our own authentic selves, I think that kids are so good at like reading through, when we're kind of putting on a face for them and when we're really showing up for them. And we can prepare ourselves for making mistakes. We can prepare ourselves for having to go back and revisit a conversation or pivot our support in a different way if we can just show up as us in all of our imperfections.
I love that. Thank you. I think it gives us extra permission to actually step in and lean into this because I've seen it in my own life and I've heard about it through the course that sometimes because we're nervous to say the wrong thing, we don't say anything at all. And then we leave children feeling alone in their questions and in their worries and in their sadness. And that's so much worse than potentially fumbling over your words or saying the wrong thing and then having to take a step back and restate it in a different way. So thank you for bringing that up. And
you can % guarantee that you will make mistakes. So once you can accept that, then I think that it's easier to show up with that authenticity. And you're right, like that danger of disconnecting kids that comes from kind of our sense of protection of them leaves them over here trying to figure things out instead of with the support and companionship that their community and friends and family and that we can provide.
Beautifully said. And with authenticity, it also struck me to acknowledge that also means through our own family culture and whatever that means for us and a belief system, potentially practices, rituals, norms within that family, and it will look different from family to family.
Yep.
Okay, Jess, can I throw the same question over to you?
Sure. So my role is a little bit different. I work in pediatric palliative care, which is working with kids that have a life-limiting illness. So most people would be surprised that kids on pediatric palliative care are living. It's not hospice. And so these kids live usually for a really long time, and they have these undulating patterns of great wellness, and then they go to these valleys where they kind of skim the veil, and then they'll pop back up, and either they have a new baseline or they return to their old baseline. So they really are living a long time. And where we see the support coming in for children is around siblings. And so what I've learned is that children don't process grief the same way adults do. We know that. And they often need creative and kinesthetic ways to process things. So music therapy, art therapy, play therapy, but not necessarily traditional talk therapy. And interestingly enough, one of the place in my life that this is the most relevant is my work as a home health nurse working with first-time Medicaid moms. I worked with moms in this age range, we're talking like 14 to 18, and 1 in 4 pregnancies about ends in loss. And so I worked with a lot of moms from losing a pregnancy at 8 weeks to losing a full-term pregnancy. And what I learned is that they are the experts on their own lives. So Allie touched on this too, that we go into this profession because we have a need to help and support, and we have to listen to what their need is and kind of set aside our own need, where we might feel like we know what we need to do to be useful, but we're not really listening. And by listening, I don't just mean their words, I mean like their micro movements, because sometimes they're not telling us words. So you have to kind of assess the space between and see what they're really saying and what they need. So yeah, and they all respond differently. Some of them wanted me to be there twice a day, and some of them needed to never have contact with me again. And that felt hard for me, but I had to honor that because it was what they needed.
Thank you for that. And really making sure that we're meeting the needs of that specific person that we're serving. And we don't just come in with, okay, here's our agenda, or here are the 3 main approaches that I always utilize. We can have some foundational skills that seem to work well. And then we have to customize from there always and see what's happening in that moment. We may even have a plan for a visit, and it may go right out the window, depending on what's going on that day. So flexibility is so important. Okay, so Allie, could you share a story, while respecting confidentiality, of working with a young person that taught you something profound or surprising?
Absolutely. And I thought a little bit about this question, and I kind of have 3 different ones that I'm bouncing between in my head. So I'm going to try to see where I land. But I can share one specific story honoring confidentiality. I was working with a family where there was a child who was preparing to lose a mother in a very unexpected and tragic way. And the father and I had sat down and had a lot of discussions about how to prepare this young child for their mother's death, and how to talk to this young child about death in general, because this was really their first experience with loss. And it was obviously a very significant experience. And together, through my conversations with the father, I gained a lot of insight about how their family, their belief systems, their cultural background and religious background, and how they as a family, wanted to talk about death, which again, both Jess and Francesca touched on it, how that important that is. It's setting aside, our ideas and our expectations, and really stepping into the family's experience. And so together with the dad, we crafted, a little bit about what we wanted to say to this young child. And we had what felt like a really beautiful, albeit very sad and very hard conversation with this young child about their mother's death. And it felt like, from my perspective, that it was really clear, it was really simple, it wasn't over explaining anything, and it really most importantly, encompassed the family's belief system, which was this idea of when somebody dies, they go back to the earth and their body becomes part of the natural cycle in life. And so that was what was really important to them. Directly after we had the conversation, the child was very thoughtful and did some playing, and then came back to us and said, okay, so, I mom's dying, but she's going to go back to the earth, right? And then she's going to grow into a little girl, and then she's going to be a mom who marries daddy again, and she'll come back. So when does that part happen? And logically, I know that young children need a lot of repetition. Young children need a lot of simplicity. But emotionally, for the father, I could tell like he's going to have to engage in this conversation a lot. And it just reminded me how emotionally depleting it is to kind of prepare for those really big conversations and realize that it's not just one really big conversation and then it's over. It's a process. And kids are going to make sense and meaning of it in ways that is protective and important to them as they go on. And it often means supporting the adults in the situation, because just when their emotions and their energy is most depleted, the child has emotions and energy that needs to be attended to. And it often means repeating the same hard information over and over again, because kids will be kind of pushing on the limits to see what is right and what is true. So I don't know if that's a great example, but it just reminded me of how important it is to support adults in those conversations and the need for repetition in young kids. And even when we think that we do it like quote unquote right, and there is no like right or wrong, it's still a conversation that needs to be revisited. And then just one other example, and this isn't a specific example, but more of a general example, is that sometimes when we're working with kids and teens and youth, we go in with this focus and this perspective about loss and about grief and about the death. And sometimes their need is not about the grief or the loss or the death. And just a reminder that kids' lives are complicated and there's always a web of things that are going on. And sometimes kids need a sense of normalcy in their conversations too. And, sometimes because of what I do, I see things, like I said, through that lens of how is the death impacting this? And I think that's an important lens to see it through, because everything impacts everything else. But sometimes kids have taught me and showed me that, what they need in that moment isn't necessarily about what I'm going in to focus on. And that goes back to what Francesca said about kind of like putting our agenda aside and our expectations aside and welcoming wherever they're at.
Thank you, Allie. I got so wrapped up in your wonderful share that I totally missed that people are waiting in the waiting room. Thank you. That really brings to mind, I have this idea of, and I'm sure other people have this idea as well, but that we dose ourselves. And you see this really clearly with kids. Sometimes adults, I think we kind of, we still dose ourselves, but we do it in a way that's a little bit more filtered, or we're more careful about what we show or don't show. And with kids, it's just really pure. And they could be really upset. I mean, just wailing, crying, so angry, physically, emotionally. And then in the next moment, they want to play with trucks, or they want to build something, or they want to color for a while, or they want to talk about their favorite song. And it can feel very drastic and even kind of jarring to those of us who are offering support, but it's really healthy and it's a part of the process for them. Thank you. Jess, do you have a story that stands out that you're willing to share?
I do. I sometimes struggle with stories of people I've worked with because it sometimes doesn't feel like my story to share. But I would love to share the first significant loss in my life from when I was a child, because seeing things through my 9-year-old lens was part of setting the stage for me for how I've dealt with grief in my whole life. So bear with me here. My grandfather died when I was in 3rd grade. I was 9 years old and he had a stroke. He was a minister and he had this very booming, like James Earl Jones voice. And he just had this kind of like commanding presence, not in a negative way, but just also very inviting. And he was really a pillar in our family. And so I remember when he died, we were at the hospital and we were sitting in the waiting room. I remember we were allowed, we like came to the threshold of the door where he was dying and we're allowed to like peek in, but that was it. And then we were like whisked away. And then I remember my dad coming into the waiting room and it's the only time I've seen my father like choke as in like choke on his words, and cry. And he said to my uncle, I was afraid he was going to live. And I remember feeling so confused by this phrase, like, why would you, of course it makes sense to me now as an adult, but like, why would you be afraid that your father was going to live? Like, that's such a strange thing to say. And then I remember going to the funeral and seeing his casket at the front of the room. And it was this, everything seemed so big to me because I was 9. So the casket just seemed huge. It was closed. And I remember all the adults, I remember them specifically looking like paper doll cutouts. That's what I thought of them. Like they all looked exactly the same. They all had the same facial expression. They all were doing the same thing with their body. And it felt like they were putting on this performance. And like I was in the audience and didn't understand what the plot was. Like I didn't feel overly sad. And I just didn't understand. And during the funeral, all the cousins were asked to like, we weren't allowed to stay. And we played this like wild game of hide and go seek during the funeral. And I remember like running and hiding in this wooden closet. And it was like one of the first times that I was like by myself. And so I was sitting there and I remember I just started thinking like, how do they know his body's in that casket? Like, how do they know that he's not still alive? What if he, appears to me when I come around the corner? Like I hadn't been allowed to ask any questions. And so we played this wild game of hide and go seek. And then afterwards, we went to the celebration of life. And when I left all these adults, they were all these paper cutouts being sad. And then when I came to the celebration of life, everybody was like eating and laughing and like telling stories. And so I felt like I had this whiplash of like, okay, I'm confused about how I'm supposed to be reacting in this moment. And I feel like this was kind of a common thread throughout my childhood that like we were the observers, but the grief was really the adults' loss, but it wasn't really recognized that it was our loss. So shortly after that, I was playing in my bedroom and a bird hit my window. And I remember looking at the bird out the window. It had broken its neck. And I was so curious about death that I took my screen out of my window as a 9-year-old, climbed out onto the roof, got a little shoebox and put like pillows and stuff in it, picked the bird up and brought it into my bedroom so that I could watch it. And see what happened. Part is while I had this bird in my room for it seemed like a long time. And I just kept checking on it and wondering, like, if I stare at it long enough, is it going to move? Is it going to have little black X's over its eyes? Like, are the feathers going to fall out? What's going to happen? So after I was done watching this bird and felt like I'd gotten the information I needed, I brought it downstairs and put it on the kitchen counter. And my mom came in and was appalled that I had brought this bird into the house and that I climbed onto a second floor roof to get the bird, and she threw it away and we never talked about it ever again. And it was my way as a little 9-year-old of like begging to understand and to have a safe space to ask these questions. And I think if you don't allow kids to ask questions and give them this safe space, that they fill in the blanks. And we have incredibly imaginative, fantastical minds. And so it becomes really scary. And so that's, I guess, one of the things that I learned early on is that we need to allow people the space to be able to ask these questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's just a beautiful share. And I want to honor that loss for you and hope that you've been able to access healing. It's never too late. And that by sharing that story and tending to your child self somehow, even as an adult, that you're able to feel heard and involved in some way even now. And that as a legacy of that loss, that you're able to share that with us and that we're able to take that story forward. So thank you. I think getting a glimpse into the mind of a child and how we're trying to reconcile our experience. And like you mentioned, Jess, we're looking to adults and we're seeing what they're doing and how they're responding and how they're reacting. And that's cueing us in some way, but sometimes that's really confusing because depending on how we're gathering or not, especially during COVID, and what the kind of feeling is within those gatherings. Is it emotional? Is it not? Are people very stoic? Are they sharing anything? Is it very quiet? Or is it an open casket? Is it a closed casket? Is it a celebration of life where the body's not present? Has the child been invited to say goodbye or not? Has the child been included in conversations or asked if they have any questions? All of those are such important factors. And what I hear not uncommonly in our doula course is that adults carry this. I mean, this leaves an imprint that doesn't go away. And some people are drawn to this work so that they can become the source of support that they didn't receive when they needed it, which is really beautiful. And because they know that they still have these unhealed wounds that they're carrying. Okay, take a little breath after that one. So Allie, how do you prepare yourself for entering into these times of intensity with those you support?
That's a great question. I think I'm big on kind of rituals for myself, and now my work is a little bit different. I'm in private practice, so I can structure my schedule in a way that I can like make some space and some time for that. When I was at the hospital, I was, maybe companioning 4 or 5 families a day through their end of life experiences on a busy day. And going right from one to the next. And sometimes it was anticipated loss. Sometimes it was something that was completely unanticipated. So it was a lot of having to, go from one really intense situation, and really, because we know that loss and grief is really unique and specific to the person and the family experiencing it, it would be like going from one really unique experience to the next really unique experience, and the level of intensity was pretty consistent throughout. So at the hospital, sometimes I wouldn't have time to like even go to the bathroom or eat my lunch, but I would always take time in between supporting families to do like a quick mantra or like a check-in with myself, even if it was like 15 seconds of deep breathing. I did a lot of what I felt like were walking meditations between one side of the hospital to the next, where I had this kind of inner ritual of like cleansing and honoring where I was just coming from, and then kind of shedding it to prepare for what I was going to go into next. So mantras for me were really helpful, and I would like have little things that I would repeat. And if I was nervous, it might be, you can only do the best that you can do. But it was just trying to create space in between families to really like, not, in a way I had to kind of compartmentalize what I was doing. And then at the end of the day, could tend to everything that had happened. But in between those people, I needed to do like a quick little check-in so that I could then go into the next experience. So a lot of rituals, a lot of, deep breathing, mantras, little walking meditations, even if it had to be really quick.
Thank you. And I think for some people who are kind of going in and out of rooms, I noticed this for myself at our respite house, that the threshold of the doorway could be a really symbolic sort of pause, even for just 10 seconds or so, to take a breath, pause, leave behind, and then enter in, open. And then when you exit, same thing, sort of pause, gratitude for what happened, leave behind, open up for what's coming, and how important that is to do mindfully.
Absolutely.
Jess, anything to add about your practices?
Mine is almost identical. Just kind of having this continuous self-inquiry of how I am habitually responding to grief and loss at that time in my own life, and then assessing that before I cross that threshold with somebody else, just so that I can be really aware of the ways that I might be reactive to the things that they're telling me. So very similar.
Wonderful. A lot of mindfulness throughout. Just being aware is so important. So I do have a couple more questions, but looking at the clock, I want to open it up to other people in case anyone else has something. So feel free if you would like to unmute. Oh, I have somebody waiting in the waiting room again. I don't know if Chelsea got kicked out, but welcome back. And anybody wants to, you can raise your hand if you would like to speak on camera, or you can put something in the chat. Totally your call, your preference. So I'll give everybody a minute to just think of something. Okay, I see something coming up and it says KM, and then I think it says Kristen. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Martin. I'm head of school at the Montessori School of Central Vermont. So my focus is really kind of child development and working with children. We have enrolled here toddlers 18 months up to age 12. And in talking about creating space and leaving space for children to ask questions, from a child development standpoint, I just want everyone to remember the assumptions we make as adults when children ask those questions. And sometimes we need to ask a clarifying question back before we respond, because we as adults, like I said, bring a lot of assumptions. So when we're talking about sex education, for example, and a child's like, what is sex? It might be important to ask, what do you mean by that question? And they might just say, well, what does M and F mean? Oh, male and female, right? So you don't have to get into the bigger kind of adult place where your brain goes. And I can't stay much longer because I have to go cover in the classrooms. So I just wanted to give that little kind of child development background when we're talking about providing space for children.
Thank you. And that is a wonderful example and gave me a chuckle.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think that's really important that we do mirror back what they've said so that we have clarity about what they're actually asking. And then especially with these topics where we won't have all of the answers, to say, you know, well, what do you think? And you can wonder together.
Absolutely.
What else, Allie?
I was just going to add, yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Kristen. I think that's so important. And it's also about like looking for the need that's behind the question. It's not always a question that needs to be answered logically, and as adults we tend to go into that like fix it mode, and yeah, I love that example of the sex and the M and F, and you're like, okay, yeah, okay, that's what you're asking. But it's also looking for the need behind the question. So what is this child trying to express? Is it that they're, you know, trying to regain a sense of security, that they're feeling like their sense of safety has shifted, or is there anger behind it? Is there sadness? And it's mostly about attending to the need, not necessarily answering the question.
Yeah, and always okay to say, I don't know. Always okay.
Yep. One that I often go back to is like, that's a really, really great question. And I want to be really thoughtful about how we talk about that and how I answer that for you. So I'm going to think about it, and let's make sure that we make some space and some time to talk about that.
That's great, because sometimes we are caught off guard a little bit, or we can notice that we are particularly triggered by a question. And perhaps because of that triggering or doubt in our own minds, we might not be in the best state to provide that space at that moment. So that's great to sometimes say, I hear you. I really want to have this conversation. Let's press pause for right now and make space for this. And then definitely return to it. Okay, so yes, I am sending out the recorded version to everyone. And sorry about the Zoom troubles. That does happen from time to time, getting kicked out. So you will get the recording. Be right back jar. Let's write down the question and come back to that later. That's great. And maybe it's because you also want to involve another person, maybe another loved one, maybe a spouse, maybe a grandparent, maybe someone else. You feel like it would be really valuable to not face that conversation alone. And that's okay too. So what else? Oh, I see Lori has a question. Go ahead, Lori.
So I'm not really working with kids much, but you never know. Any suggestions on how to answer the question when one parent has died and the child, say the mother has died, and the child says, so what's going to happen to me if daddy dies? Just open to suggestion on what you guys have said in response to that. I know there's not an absolute right or wrong, but what have you said to that question in the past?
Go ahead, Allie.
Yeah, I think that for me, again, that's like the kind of question where we're assessing the need behind the question. And that need is about the sense of safety and security and that idea of feeling really vulnerable. So I would, I think sometimes there's a logical answer to that question and obviously involving the family in that. And sometimes there's an answer that we can give a child that that's something that we've thought of. And these are all the people who love you and take care of you and want to support you. And, right now I feel really healthy and I feel really good. There's no reason to believe that anything would happen to me. But if someday, if something did happen, that our family has made these arrangements to help take care of you. But first, even before I got to that place, I would validate that it feels really scary when the people that you care about have died, and it can make you feel really scared about, your sense of safety, your sense of security, who's going to take care of you. So I would honor and validate that need. And then if it feels like that's a question that really needs to be answered, then obviously include the family in how to answer that.
Thank you.
Jess, did you want to add?
Yeah, I also think that for me, Allie is a therapist and I am not. So there are times when children would ask me questions that I felt like I needed to refer to somebody that had more expertise than I did. So that's always okay to do too. I think what Allie said about validating, I think, and that it actually probably is something, if the parents have, or if the living parent hasn't thought about this yet, it's a conversation that can happen with parents also, but to have an actual answer, an honest answer to be able to provide is important.
And I'll just add to those two that in my experience in supporting families, that often that is on the mind of the surviving parent, and that can weigh very heavily, and that the surviving parent can be quite worried about it as well. So to make sure that we create space to support that parent, because that parent could be saying, oh my gosh, this happened, so it can happen. And what if it does happen to me? And that would destroy my children. And it could be just as overwhelming to the parent as it is to the child. Just to keep that in mind. Roxanne, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I don't work with kids, but it is as important as to me as I'm aware, because I work with dementia patients, and childhood is coming back to haunt them mostly. And for example, I have a lady right now who is pretty stable, but she keeps on talking about that when her parents died, nobody supported her. She was just put in the system and basically adopted out. And every time I visit her, she keeps on talking about it. So that shows you how important it is to really talk about it and to work on it, I guess. But I mean, she has dementia, so there's really I can assure her that she's okay. But for a person who doesn't have dementia, when you're an adult, how do you address it to fix it? That loss that you had in early childhood, when nobody helped you through it.
Thank you. That's a great question. Thanks for bringing up dementia, because it can be, it was on my mind even earlier as well, when you share the news with someone with dementia, and then you have to potentially repeat that news, which is similar to working with children as well. So there are a lot of complexities there. And I appreciate your work that you offer, Roxanne, to people. And the feeling of your presence is what is experienced by people with dementia even more readily than what you're able to communicate with words. And so being kind, calm, and caring goes so far. But I want to default over to Allie to see if you have any suggestions about opening up that healing, because sometimes we have this assumption that time will heal. Well, time doesn't just automatically heal on its own. There's work there.
Right, right. And I think that's where we tend to get into that fix it mode rather than the be mode, and to take the pressure off of yourself to have something to fix it, because in reality, there's nothing that you're going to fix there. But you can do so much just by being present. And I know that that's like the simplistic answer. And there's sometimes where I'm attending workshops and I'm talking to people, I'm like, yes, I get it. I have to be, but tell me, how do I need to be? Because then I need, doing something just feels so much more comfortable to us. But I would imagine that making space for those conversations and making space for that process that person is going through goes a long way in terms of fixing, quote unquote, what they're working on. So shift from the fix to the be, from the do to the be.
Thank you. And sometimes creativity can be useful too. So you could say, do you want to do a project with me to honor this feeling that you're carrying right now? And it could be a mandala with flower petals. And as long as you set the intention that what we're doing here together is honoring this loss that you still carry, or honoring your broken heart, or honoring you as a child, however it works to term it, or art, painting, something that this person might enjoy as well. All right, I'm going to bounce over to you, Janice. Go ahead.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Francesca. So I'm a recently retired hospice director, volunteer coordinator, manager of and social worker, over 30 years in hospice. And I want to thank Jessica for your personal story, because for me, you brought up so many stories and teachable moments over the years that I've done this work. But I particularly want to share that when we first started grief groups in Nashua, New Hampshire, where we had enough population to separate kids by age group, because we know they grieve differently at different stages. The youngest group was led by a preschool teacher, and she got this bright idea to find a dead bird and bring it in a shoebox to the group to explain to the children what happens when your body dies. And then they would do a ritual around the burial, and they would actually bury the bird in the shoebox. So that was an effective tool. And the humor of it all was those of us involved would be on the lookout for dead birds all the time, and she would keep them in her freezer. So she had one for the next time the group was going to happen. So I loved your story, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think based on today, there might be more dead birds in freezers. But it's helpful. I mean, we can look to nature, and we can look to, a worm that has dried up on the side of the road, or, a dead bug, a fly that has died in a windowsill. And that can become a conversation starter for these kids. So thank you. And congrats, Janice, on your work and your tenure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Chelsea, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Schilfant. I'm the clinical hospice educator for the University of Vermont Home Health and Hospice, which includes our home community setting and our inpatient hospice facility. I've done some work with pediatric palliative care. My background's in peds. I wanted to bring up and pose people's experience. I love that everyone's have been talking about creating space and pausing and giving people room to have those moments and not trying to fix it, because I'm always trying to train clinical staff. Sometimes we just have to let it be, let it process, let it be, and just be present. It's always about being present. One thing I struggle with sometimes with clinicians, helping guide a family through end of life that they want to be home. We have small children in the home, and they're actually watching the process. And it's trying to guide clinicians, nurses, other members of our IDG is how do we support children who are in the home and watching that process. And I wanted to reach out and see if people had tactics or issues they've run into of how we still keep children involved, but how we let them process through watching an active death, like through the end. So.
Thank you, Chelsea, and it's so nice to see you. And I'm sure for a lot of our community here that have taken the course, you look very familiar. So they'll be excited to see you from all of your great presentations. I want to turn this over to Jess. I also just want to note that, we're kind of nearing our hour. So I understand if people have to leave, please stay on. We'll make sure we get through these questions and then I'll stop the recording and then we'll do the book giveaway. So go ahead, Jess.
So I think that if families are bringing someone home to die, hopefully they've thought about how it impacts the child that's in the home, but also somehow giving children an active role if they would like it. So offering them some sort of control in the situation that feels totally out of control, whether that control is choosing to not participate or that control is choosing to play an active role in whatever way is appropriate for them in the death of their loved one at home. I don't know if that's helpful at all, Chelsea.
That's great. I just, it's interesting because we're seeing a lot more of death at home and people wanting that choice, and the family is still happening. Like the family is still there, but there's definitely a change. And I just, I think of a case recently where it was a young family. One of the spouses, the parents were dying, and the mother was just perplexed because she wanted to honor the father. The father wanted to be home with his family. And it was during the midst of COVID where we had restrictions on visitation. I mean, COVID changed everything. So more people are dying at home, not dying in hospital situations or inpatient facilities. So how do we help support that process while they're still trying to be parents, but also keep them involved in this journey that the dad's going through. So I was just wondering if people have similar situation or things that have worked or not worked well for them.
Yeah. I also think that creating kind of a hard days plan with kids is super helpful. So to have something that they're going to go to, coping skills that are already established that they can kind of pull out of their toolbox when a day feels really hard. Because, it's kind of this undulating, it's not always like this steady downhill. And so the days that the kiddos are feeling they're really struggling, they can tap into this plan that they've already created.
Thank you for bringing that up, Chelsea, and for answering Jess and sharing your perspective. I think that there's such an opportunity there, Chelsea, for clinicians to be able to model as well how we communicate with children, how we can kind of meet their needs and do a little exploring, but let the child lead the pace and the depth of that exploration. And then that way the other adults that are in the home, visitors, loved ones, caretakers can be cued by what they're seeing from the clinicians. And that's a really important opportunity to point out that they have that. I mean, it could feel like a heavy responsibility, but that they have that opportunity to be able to demonstrate to families how that can be done. It brings to mind, I just talked about this a little bit at the NEDA Doula Palooza, but just this weekend I attended a celebration of life and felt like I needed to support a young child who was honoring this deep, profound loss. And what I noticed, I heard you say, Jess, at one point, the micro movements. And what I noticed initially right off the bat from this very young child was like antsiness and sort of like, I'm lost here. I don't know what to do with myself. I don't know where I am. I don't know where to go. And so I immediately engaged this kid. I invited this kid to help me. And it was preparing the drinks, but this kid did the preparation so thoughtfully and like also kind of like was shaking the cans of seltzer, which I just found funny. And I told him, I was like, those might kind of blow up on people, but I also thought it was just kind of funny to let him do his thing. And he arranged them so thoughtfully. And then we brought them out together and prepared them. And he felt like, I think he felt included, he felt involved, he felt like he had a purpose there, he had a job to do. And in that way, he was honoring the loss. And then we went outdoors because I asked him, do you want to go get some fresh air for a couple minutes before the service began? Because I could even use a little fresh air before this really intense service. And he was showing me, we were looking at this cascading fields, and there was ponds and woods and property lines, and then a lake in the distance. And he was doing something with his hands. And I asked him what he was doing because I thought he was counting. And he said, oh, I'm deciding how I would get myself over to the lake. So he was setting his course. And to me, it just seemed like this beautiful analogy of grief and his journey to come and all the healing that was going to unfold for him and how he was going to set his course. And he could definitely use a companion and encouragement to find his way, but it was going to be his way through it. Okay, I think we could go on for another hour, but let's answer another couple questions. Carol, go ahead. And Allie and Jess, I don't know how much time you have. I know that there might be a pinch there, so please feel free if you have to log off.
I'm good.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Carol. I'm from Ottawa in Canada. I finished my doula training this summer, so I haven't practiced yet. And I really can't wait to start. I've been volunteering for about 7 or 8 years in pediatric palliative care and visiting home hospice, bereavement groups with children. So it's just where I love to be. And thank you for these amazing, amazing stories. Every one of them has been so touching and really resonate with the work that I've been honored to do, especially when you talk about children and the way they process grief. I was thinking of a bereavement group, that kind of puddle jumping, where I sat and chatted with this little girl about the death of her little brother. And it was so poignant and so deep. And then, you know, when we dried the tears, I said, do you have other questions you'd like to ask? And she said, yeah, why were soda crackers invented? Why would someone invent something that tastes so bad? So it was just that came back to me, and I'd quite forgotten it, that example of how children can just shift. And it's quite startling from being, you know, very deep in their grief to just moving on and thinking about something else. But I could babble all day. I guess my question is, and this is something that may come up with a child I'm working with, any thoughts anyone might have on speaking to children about medical assistance in dying? I know that's a big question, but I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts. And thank you for this wonderful conversation today.
Thank you, Carol, for joining us and doing your important work in Canada. And obviously this might come up more for you there than necessarily for us. It's legal. Medical aid in dying is a legal option here for us, but not everywhere in the States, as you know, or elsewhere globally. And I know of someone who's actually in Canada who's trying to write a picture book about this, about introducing the idea to children, because it can be confusing and it can be overwhelming, and you don't want to give too much information or too many details that could actually traumatize a child. Yet with medical aid in dying, I mean, one of the benefits that comes to my mind is that because of the planning, you have some time and space to really, depending on the disease progression and what the person is facing in terms of suffering, you have the potential for moments of connection and moments that are really special and can be captured, photographs and memories, legacy work, maybe going through something like the companion activity book, creating a photo book or a scrapbook with that person. And then that will help to prepare the child as they think about, I'm going to have these memories that will carry me through this loss. I don't think that it's likely appropriate to have a child witnessing a medical aid in dying. Now, that's just my own sort of perspective here, because it's just an intense experience. It could be okay if all sorts of levels of support are involved, and if it's best case scenario in terms of the person's particular illness and the way that that person's going to, ingest medication for their dying process. But there are just moments that might catch people by surprise, and it would be really hard to also support a child through those unexpected moments. So, but you can give the kid an opportunity for a goodbye if the person is willing and available for that. So that's what comes to mind for me. Anybody else want to add to that?
I was thinking along the same lines, Francesca, about the legacy building and the memory making that can be offered, and like the kind of intentional, kind of anticipatory loss experience. And then I think that it's that kind of scenario, the hard answer is that it's going to be very specific to the child, and there's probably going to be a lot of assessment needed in order to determine kind of what level of information the child needs and can tolerate, and what kind of active participation or inactive participation they might need.
Okay, thanks. Let's buzz through like 2 more questions and then we will wrap up here. It's so great having conversation with everybody. I don't want to stop, but I want to respect people's time. So Wendy and Lauren.
Hi, it's Lauren, and I'm here in Austin, Texas with Wendy. I went through the ANELDA training recently, and Wendy went through UVM, and we're really excited to know each other and to be doing some work together. But my question was, I was really intrigued when people were giving Roxanne some suggestions about how she could be with her dementia patient who is kind of cycling back through her feelings of abandonment. And I'm really curious to see if the patient stops, if there's a place at which she can do this work. And even if she doesn't have her memory, like if something inside of her heals and she stops asking those questions. So I guess if I'm just really curious to see about that. So if Roxanne can let you know and you can like email the group or something, or maybe we can ask her if we're in a subsequent webinar together, but I just am or to see maybe if anybody has a story of something like that where, I remember my grandmother had dementia and she would call my mother every day and say, I'm ready to come home. And my mother would tell her like, oh, well, the hotel is expecting you and they have your dinner reservation tonight. And she would just tell her what she needed to get through that night until the next day when she'd ask the question again. But I'm wondering if there's any point at which this person just stops asking those questions and seems to feel peace about that based on some of the tools that were suggested. So
that's a fascinating question. Allie, from a mental health perspective, do you have any information you can share?
I don't have a lot of experience working with people with dementia, so I don't want to kind of step outside my scope of what I know. But I just imagine that I'd be curious too. Honestly, I'd be curious what that process is like. But I think the process of validating, of hearing, of making space for something that maybe wasn't allowed to have space before in other areas of their life, from a mental health perspective, I would hope and I would think that would touch on something.
Thank you. Yeah, something lasting, hopefully.
Yeah.
I see that somebody put Chelsea Petal's circle space in there. Was that a reference to the picture book? I think that could be, I'm not sure, but because I forget, I was in touch with somebody, it could be Chelsea. All right, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Lemery? Please correct me.
Yes, Lemari, hi.
Hi, how are you? Welcome.
Good, how are you? So
Good,
I
thank
am
you.
a grief and doula specialist. I am a end-of-life doula. I am a birth and behavior doula. I am a chaplain, and I also am a funeral director. So I have a question. I do a lot of roles, but basically my question, and then I want to say something real quick, is how do we deal with parents that don't want to talk about the loss that they know that is happening with a child, and the child is ready to talk about finally letting go, and the parents are not ready for that? How do we have the conversation with the children, but also for the parents, because the children want to have those questions answered?
Right, because you're honoring where the family is at and you're not wanting to overstep your boundary of supporting the family in their experience, but you're observing and you have maybe a different perspective than the family has in terms of your clinical experience, that this child has some more needs than are being addressed. I mean, from my perspective, I offer a lot of psychoeducation to adults going through the process. So making a lot of, if I was observing something like that, I would make a lot of space for working with the adults and just, very gently offering what I've observed from the child and helping them. Because oftentimes if a parent or an adult doesn't want to talk to children about something, it's because of their own, insecurities about it. It's their own vulnerabilities. It's their own experiences or not having experiences with talking about this stuff. So I'd make a lot of space for having those conversations with the adults so that they feel a sense of safety in talking to kids, because they might feel like, maybe the child shouldn't hear any of this, or, it's too hard for me to even go to that place because I'm grieving so intensely. I can't even bring in the perspective of that my child is grieving too. Like, that's a hard place for people to go. So I would make a lot of space for connection with the adult. And then if it feels like you're not getting there with them, and depending on what your nature and your relationship is with the child, is, you know, the invitation for them to have that safe space with you. You don't have to overstep any family boundaries or like share any information that's not yours to share, to accompany a child in that experience and help work through with some creative tools and techniques what they're thinking and what they're feeling.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for these wonderful questions and this discussion and your time today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can do our fun giveaway.